Well, welcome to another edition of Monocle and Spade, where we explore the world of the Bible and beyond through the lens of history and archaeology. And I'm your host, Ted Wright. Thank you so much for joining with us today. I'm very excited to have a very special guest with me, joining me today to talk about something that's very important. We have Dr. Craig Evans, who is a New Testament scholar, and his credentials are just excellent. Just go through a few of these. We would, if I went through the whole thing, we'd be here for like probably an hour. But he's just a great guy and a great scholar. Dr. Evans has a doctorate from Karoli Gaspar Reformatus University in Budapest, where his thesis was Jesus and the Fall of Satan, Studies in Demonology and the Early Christian Movement, which sounds like a fascinating thesis. He also has a PhD from Claremont Graduate University in California, where his thesis was Isaiah chapter 6, verses 9 through 10 in early Christian and Jewish interpretation, and another fascinating subject, and a master's degree from Claremont University as well, MDiv from Western Baptist Seminary in Oregon, and then also a BA from Claremont McKenna College in California. He is currently serving as John Bisagno Distinguished Professor of Christian Origins at Houston Baptist University, and had the honor of having coffee with Dr. Evans earlier this year before all of the COVID stuff happened. I was there in Houston visiting some friends. Before that, Dr. Evans was hopefully I'm saying this correct, Pesant Distinguished Professor of New Testament at Acadia Divinity College from 2002 to 2015. And then before that, he was professor at Trinity Western University from 1981 to 2002, and then it goes on and on. He has multiple books published. If you want to know more, you can go to his website at craigevans.com and read more about that in his books. But just a few of these: Jesus and the Manuscripts, which explores some of the early manuscripts concerning the life of Christ; Ancient Jewish and Christian Scriptures, that he co-authored with John Collins and Lee Martin McDonald; many other books that Dr. Evans has written. And so I would encourage you to go check that out. And Dr. Evans, thank you so much for coming on Monocle and Spade. It's so great to have you today.
Well, you're very welcome. My pleasure.
Thank you so much. Well, you know, we're right now in the middle, and I don't know when you're going to be watching this, because people will watch this in different times, but there are a lot of questions that we face in our culture and in America. But honestly, I think Dr. Evans would agree with me, one of the most important questions beyond politics, beyond culture, beyond anything else, is the question of Jesus and who Jesus was, who he said he was, and who he actually was. And one of the key documents that modern people learn about the life of Jesus, is the New Testament. And today we have a New Testament scholar and a New Testament historian. And Dr. Evans, one of the things that I'm an archaeologist, and so one of the things that I've told my listeners is that, you know, as archaeologists, we study the past through artifacts, whereas historians study the past through written text and inscriptions and evidence and things like that. So the question of history and how do we know the past is an important question that we explore at Epic Archaeology and also on Monocle and Spade. And on previous episodes, we have interviewed some really great archaeologists and scholars, Dr. Doug Petrovich, who's there in Houston with yourself, and also Scott Stripling, who's an archaeologist. And so today, it's great to have you as a historian, but you've also done some archaeology as well, correct?
Yeah, that's right. I've been a volunteer digger at a few sites over the years, and I think it's good for biblical scholars. They may not be archaeologists, but you really should do some volunteering and see how archaeology is done, crawl around in the holes, use the trowel, sift, find things, and just learn about it firsthand, not just read books about it, but learn it firsthand.
Absolutely, I totally agree. So, so I want to ask you one of the things that, and we're going to, as we sort of dig into this, this will sort of lead us into the discussion, and that is, so today in the modern world, we are a media-driven culture. I mean, we get our news from the internet, we get our news from television, we get our news from who knows what else, Twitter, you know. And one of the questions that people struggle with today is, how do we know what we can trust? You know, can we trust CNN? Can we trust, you know, Fox News? Can we trust whatever, you know? And so in the ancient world, I mean, we're talking about, as Christians, we are holding up a truth. We believe, living now in the year 2020, which has been a crazy year so far, but we believe that there was a man that lived 2,000 years ago that claimed to be God, and was crucified on a Roman cross and was buried in a borrowed Jewish tomb and then rose again, physically, bodily rose again from the third day. So if we can't trust the news today, how in the world can we get at the past? And the way I see it, and correct me if I'm wrong, and sort of guide us on this, but the way I see it is to kind of use a layman's terms, what I call primary sources. As a historian, I would say that there are basically three primary sources, and they're eyewitnesses, historical records, and archaeological remains. Is that a fairly good assessment of how we get at the past?
Yeah, that sums it up. And I will say this, Ted, people today and people 2,000 years ago aren't much different. And the question is just people. Are they willing to tell the truth? Do they have access to the truth? And how do we corroborate things? And so, you mentioned CNN and Fox and everyone else. They're just people, and they have their preferences, they have their biases, and there are ways of fact checking and cross checking. And that's true today. It is true a long time ago. It's true in between. So, in a way, it's not an impossible task, but it is a task, and you do have to do your homework.
Absolutely, that's exactly right. So with the New Testament, there's a lot of questions that people have about the New Testament, and can we actually trust that it's actually giving us accurate historical information? Before we get into that, though, we're going to dig into that here in a moment. But let me ask you, because you are literally on the cutting edge of New Testament textual criticism and scholarship. And a few years ago, I was actually in Dallas, several years ago, actually, and I think you may have been there, I'm not sure, but it was in Plano, Texas with the Josh McDowell, and they talked about some manuscripts. And so I was working with Frank Turek at the time, and there's a lot of other folks that were there. I'm not sure if you were there, but Dan Wallace was there, and he mentioned the fact that there may be a early Mark fragment. Now we know that that's not the case, but what is the current state of New Testament scholarship today? Are we getting more manuscripts that validate and affirm what we have today in our New Testament?
Yeah, I think we do. Every year, another manuscript comes to light. And by the way, there's no mystery there. It's because we have possibly as many as 400,000 pages of papyrus from antiquity not yet published.
Wow.
It's been partially sifted, or maybe one could say mostly sifted. I've seen some of these unpublished papyri sheets and leaves myself. I've been at Oxford and other places, and it's overwhelming to see the cabinets opened up, and they look like these large rectangular shaped plastic boxes, Tupperware almost. And you take the lid off, and it's just deep. It's like that. It's just filled with papyrus. It's kind of a dark brown color, most of it. Some of it has a yellowish color to it. And it's just page after page after page, box after box. And so it's going to be probably 200 years before everything is published. That's assuming we don't find more. And you never know, in the dry sands of Egypt, somebody could find another place like Oxyrhynchus, and another 100,000 sheets could come to light. Who knows? So this task will never be over. And every year, or almost every year, there's another New Testament fragment that's found. When I was in seminary, there were 79 New Testament papyri. We're at, I think, 139, and I'm told it's going to be in the 140s very soon.
Wow.
So it's almost doubled. And I'm not that old. And, it wasn't that long ago that I was in seminary. And so what it shows, let me quote you a couple of people like Eldon Epp. And Eldon Epp is no fundamentalist by any means. He's a respected, now retired, but a very respected New Testament textual critic, and he knows the papyri very well. And he has stated in 2 or 3 different publications that there are no surprises. And what he means by that, the further back we go, the closer we get to the autographs, the more records we have, and sometimes, admittedly, it's only a verse or two. Sometimes it's maybe half a chapter. But the further back we go, the more manuscripts we get from this early period, it always shows the same thing. The text is stable. And in my forthcoming book, Jesus and the Manuscripts, that's what I talk about in one of the chapters. The text is simply stable. And the idea that we go back in time and surprise, Matthew has 2 fewer chapters or 2 more chapters, or Luke looks completely different, or Romans is complete. That just hasn't happened.
Yeah.
And I say that it's important to note because there are other texts, Gnostic texts and so on, where we have 3 or 4 copies of the same text, and they are wildly different. But that is not the case with the New Testament. The books are consistent. Yeah, there are differences in some words here and there. There are some understandable scribal mistakes and variants like that, but it doesn't destabilize the text. It's the same text. And that's what these ongoing discoveries show again and again.
Wow. A couple of follow-up questions. You mentioned, and I know what it is, and I know that you know what it is, obviously. But for the folks listening, Oxyrhynchus is an amazing place. Could you just very briefly sort of what is that, and what was discovered there, and why is that important for New Testament scholarship?
I get a kick out of Oxyrhynchus. The name means the city. It means the city of the sharp-nosed fish. That's what Oxyrhynchus actually refers to. And it's near the Nile. There's a canal that takes Nile water a little bit further to the west for irrigation purposes. And so Oxyrhynchus was nothing more than a commercial farming city. Sometimes I say basically it was Bakersfield, California, 2,000 years ago. So it's important to mention that because it's not Paris, it's not London, it's not Oxford, it's not Cambridge.
Yeah,
It isn't, in other words, an intellectual center. It's not a center for the arts and the humanities. It's not a place known for its library. In other words, like Alexandria or Ephesus with its beautiful libraries, or Rhodes. Oh, no, nothing like that at all. It's ancient Bakersfield, and they grow cabbages. And yet, we find 500,000 sheets of papyrus in the trash. And it's possible that they represent, because they're near the surface that stayed dry, maybe half or even 1/3 of all of the written material thrown in the trash. And that's trash. You usually don't throw your best books out in the trash. So if that's the trash, what wasn't thrown out?
exactly.
And the people that have looked at it, there are classical works, fragments of classical works recovered from the trash at Oxyrhynchus, Egypt, that we didn't even know existed. So what is humbling for us is that we now recognize that the literature of the past is just a tiny fraction that we have. And they had all of that literature and more in Bakersfield, Egypt, first century. And I like to say that because I just want to put it in perspective. This is not, it's not Duke University. It's not Harvard we're talking about. It's Bakersfield, where
That's
they're growing cucumbers. And they've got all this literature there. And it's the lion's share. It's over 90% of the papyri that we possess from antiquity from that place. Just imagine if we had the papyrus, had all the books and so on,
oh,
the ancient world, it would be in the millions of
absolutely.
writings. Yeah, and that's exciting. We've only found a fraction of it. I hope we find a few more fractions.
Absolutely. And that's a brilliant way to put it. I love that. Bakersfield, Egypt. That's fantastic. That recalled to my mind, and I don't know how much you follow Nat Geo. I know that you were on a panel with National Geographic, but several years ago, there was an Egyptologist named Sarah Parchek, and she won the TED Prize. And she is she's a professor of Egyptology at the University of Alabama, Birmingham. And she does this thing called space archaeology. And they're discovering new sites in Egypt that they didn't even know exist. So it's possible we could find another site, another Oxyrhynchus that would just blow our socks off. But that's a great way to put it because we're not talking about Alexandria, as you said. We're not talking about these great centers of culture. We're talking about the backwater of Egypt having these incredible. So that lets you know if that's the amount of manuscripts in backwater Egypt, imagine what was actually in these big cities of learning. So thank you for that explanation. And the next sort of follow-up is sort of dovetails with that, and that is the Gnostic Gospels. And I know that a lot of internet atheists and people who are skeptics like to make a big deal out of the Gnostic Gospels. And so, as a New Testament historian, how do you deal with the challenges of the Gnostic Gospels? And I'm thinking specifically of Nag Hammadi and some other writings. Should we be concerned about that as New Testament believers, or how do we know that they're not giving us the accurate information?
Well, we do know, and I know that it's a fad in some circles, in some left-wing circles mostly, to lionize some of these odd texts. And by the way, they really got themselves into an embarrassment with a fragment of a seemingly Gnostic Coptic text that refers to Jesus's wife. That was in the news not long ago. And this is where some of my colleagues, and I know a lot of these people, I studied Coptic also when I was at Claremont. I know some of these people, and most of them are, they're good guys and they mean well, but they get a little caught up with the novel, with the new, the sensational. Some of it is media driven, and then they get victimized. And Karen King at Harvard was victimized. She's a nice person, and I feel terrible for her. Harvard was swindled. I think the Coptic fragment of the supposed, call it, Gospel of Jesus' wife, they paid at least $100,000 for that. And the guy who faked it lives in Florida. He's a German American dropout of a PhD program in Berlin where he studied Coptic just enough to be dangerous. And the whole thing was a fake. So, no, the texts we're talking about aren't fakes. They do date back 15, 16, 1700 years. They are worth studying. They do give us some insights into some ideas about how to understand Jesus through a pagan lens, through a radical Neoplatonic lens, a world that's divided into two, a good world, a spiritual light world, reigned over by a good God, then a bad world and a bad God, and all of that stuff. But to answer your question very pointedly, well, this is what I would say to a room full of non-experts who say, well, why should I trust the Gospels in the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, instead of Gnostic Gospels like the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Philip, or the Gospel of Judas, or whatever? Why? Well, I'll tell you why. It's because archaeologists, whether they're Christian or not, some of them Jewish, whether they believe in God or not, archaeologists who recruit every year hundreds of volunteers to move tons and tons of soil, rock, and debris, want to know where to dig and how to understand what they dig up. And guess what? I don't care who they are, Jewish, Christian, agnostic, they all use Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and Josephus and the book of Acts. Those are the big six. All of them do. And I haven't met an archaeologist yet in Israel who says, I wouldn't know where to dig if I hadn't read the Gospel of Thomas first, or if I hadn't consulted the Gospel of Mary, I wouldn't know what I'm doing. Nobody says that. There isn't a book on archaeology, Jesus, the early church, not a book that is based on Gnostic writings. Why? Because the Gnostic writings exhibit no verisimilitude. They don't reflect the realities as we know them from many other sources, including archaeology itself. And so when they find that Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Book of Acts, and Josephus consistently speak of real people, real places, real events, and their writings are reliable guides, so you know where to dig and then how to understand what it is you've dug up, that's why they keep using them. And it doesn't matter who they are. I can name archaeologists who are Jewish, agnostic, whatever. And they all the time, even more than liberal Christians, it's really funny to observe this. They'll say, well, it says right here in Matthew, or it says right here in the Gospel of John, and so that now I understand what I've just found.
Exactly.
I wish the left wing of biblical scholarship would listen to the archaeologists more.
Amen, brother. I could not agree. That's absolutely a brilliant way to put that. And that's exactly right. You go to the text, and it actually, as one of my colleagues, one of my archaeological colleagues says, what you read in the book, you find in the ground. And it's just there. In the book of Acts, it's incredibly historically accurate. I know you've probably been to Italy, but several years ago I was in Italy and got some friends that live in Naples, and I went to Pozzuoli, which is where the Apostle Paul landed on his way to Rome. and there's a church built in the spot where the Apostle Paul landed. So you can get the Bible in one hand and just get in a boat or hike or whatever and follow what the New Testament says. It's quite remarkable. So thank you for that. And then also, so in your, I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about, and I know that you're a historian and we're going to get back to this in a moment, but I'm really intrigued by, it was your book, Archaeology, I think of the World of Jesus. I forgot the title of it, but it was dealing with the archaeological evidence in Jesus' world. And you mentioned this city, this Greco-Roman city in Israel during the time of Christ, Sepphoris. And so one of the things that I have taught, I've taught seminary for several years, and one of the things I've taught my students is that one of the functions of archaeology is that it illuminates the text of the New Testament. It lets us know what the world of the New Testament was like. And this is, I think, the city of Sepphoris is one of those instances in which really gives us illumination into the world, into the early world of Jesus as a young boy. So for the folks that are listening, could you explain what is Sepphoris and how does it help us understand some possibilities in Jesus' early life and maybe perhaps even his, I guess, vocation as a carpenter?
Yeah, that's a good question. Sepphoris, or Tzipori, as modern Hebrew-speaking Israelis call it today, is only about 4 miles from Nazareth. Nazareth is up on a ridge. It would be an arduous walk, but you could walk in about an hour and a half. If you wanted to jog, you could. It takes about 45 minutes. It takes about 10, 12 minutes by tour bus. I mentioned that, by the way, because there was a well-known New Testament scholar, and I'm not going to mention his name, and he said, "Oh, it's not likely that Jesus ever went to Sepphoris to do any work because it's a day's walk." And an archaeologist, Jim Strange, talked about that with me there 25, almost 30 years ago. And he said, "How does this guy know that? It's so close. It just takes 45 minutes to trot from Nazareth to Sepphoris. It doesn't take a whole day to get here." Anyway, again, that just shows you, we don't walk, we don't go anywhere. Not too many people I know just commute to work 4 miles walking. They get in their car. In any case, it's close by, and you raise a good point about it, because in the teens of the first century, Herod Antipas, the tetrarch, one of the surviving sons of Herod the Great, he expanded and made magnificent the city of Sepphoris. And in the teens, Jesus himself would have been, at least 10 years, 10, 12, 14 years before his own public ministry got underway. He grows up in the family of Joseph the carpenter. And as is pointed out, carpenter probably isn't the best translation. Tekton probably means builder. And so he would work with stone and not just with wood. And so it's very likely that Jesus and perhaps another brother or two like James, along with Joseph, would have daily walked over to Sepphoris and been involved in building projects. It would have kept the small village nearby, like a bedroom community of Nazareth, quite active. And so Jesus would have had firsthand experience there. But here's where it gets interesting. What kind of a city was Sepphoris at this time? And there was a popular book that came out almost 30 years ago saying it was teeming with cynics, Hellenistic Greek speaking philosophers who held to a cynic view, which basically viewed the gods with great skepticism. The gods didn't care about us, they're indifferent, so just live a very freewheeling life. In fact, they were called cynics because the Hebrew word is kunikos, means dog-like. They looked like dogs, smelled like dogs, urinated in public. Oh my gosh. And this book suggested that Jesus was influenced by these people. Well, where was he getting this from? The archaeology? And so he would point to these beautiful mosaics, these streets that were paved and had columns, some pagan things that were found. Here was the problem. Archaeology also works on dating things. And
Yes.
we date things with stratigraphy. I
Yes.
know it's not, as you well know, Ted, it's not always that simple, but usually the new is at the top, and as you go down, it gets older.
Yeah.
Well, it turns out this guy in his book that came out 30 years ago suggesting Jesus was a cynic, he was taking second and third century artifacts that were Hellenized and just thought they were there at the beginning of the first century when Jesus as a teenager, as a young man, would have been exposed. And of course, now scholars say there were no cynics in Sepphoris prior to the year 70, that prior to the year 70, the city was as Jewish as can be. They had their little immersion pools, their mikvot. There are no pagan artifacts. They have their stone water pots according to the Jewish custom of purity. Everything about Sepphoris was Jewish. And so this whole cynic hypothesis just blew up in the 1990s and beyond because of good archaeology that included stratigraphy. So there you go.
Yeah,
So, you know, it's an important place. We learn a lot, but you can also learn the wrong thing if you're not careful with the data.
that's exactly right. And you know, archaeology, as you know, archaeology is a lot like hermeneutics. Context, context, context is important.
Absolutely.
And with archaeology, it's stratigraphy and it's pottery stratigraphy, pottery seriation. And there's been, in fact, a lot of the debates, even in Old Testament archaeology, are over an interpretation of the actual stratigraphy. And how old is this pot? It would be nice if there was a date stamped on it, but they're not, and we have to use triangulation to figure things out.
Yeah.
It's as one of my excavation manuals says, it's an unholy mess. These ancient tells, you have to disentangle all the stuff. So thank you for that. Great answer. So also, are there any other, besides Sepphoris, you as a historian, are there any other archaeological discoveries that you think are significant as it relates to the New Testament? Anything?
Oh yeah, yeah. Okay, first a general observation. There was a scholar again about 30 years ago, and I tell you, Ted, there must have been something in the water. But anyway, about 30 years ago, saying there weren't any synagogues.
Huh. Wow.
I mean, yeah. You know,
Huh.
informed archaeology people always react that way. Huh? What?
Check his head. Yeah.
What? And he was saying that there were no buildings that
Hmm.
were dedicated as synagogues. That, yeah, there were synagogues of people, groups of people that met in somebody's house, but there were no buildings you would look at and say, that's a synagogue.
Is he talking about in first century?
Yeah, there were no synagogues prior to 70.
Oh, wow.
And
Okay.
so then he argued that that means that Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and the book of Acts are all anachronistic in having Jesus go into a building recognized as a synagogue. And of course, Josephus, who grew up, you know, he's born not that long after Jesus's death. And he's wrong too when he talks about synagogues prior to the Jewish revolt in 66. It's silly. Now, of course, we actually have an inscription in North Africa with a date on it. So, by the way, sometimes archaeology is stamped with a date.
Yes.
And the date is December 55. It doesn't say 55. It's the, you know, the
Yeah. Yeah.
year of the reign of first year of Nero. But anyway, we actually have a date on it, and it's an inscription that's thanking people for making donations to repair the synagogue. Now, weren't repairing a group of people. They were repairing a building.
Building.
Yeah. Anyway, by the way, we now have at least 10 synagogues that archaeologists agree are pre 70.
Yeah.
They all fit the same building typology. They've got the bench style seating along the perimeter of the wall, inside, but the perimeter of the wall. And then you get these interior posts, at least four pillars, usually six of them, three on a side, and they don't have to be there. They're just there. It's like putting a steeple on a church. Now it's a
Yeah.
church. You don't need it, but you do it because then it looks like a church. So anyway, we've got at least, and the number is probably closer to 12, but more work needs to be done to confirm it. Well, those are the ones that have been found. Now with, you know, these drones and satellites and the imagery looking down, we'll probably find more patterns, and we'll find even more in the future. So that's my first observation. Yes, there were synagogues. The Gospels are not anachronistic. Jesus did go to synagogues. It was his custom, as the Gospels say. But the second thing is, we've made some interesting discoveries about synagogues in the last decade.
Hmm.
And you might remember in 2009, there was a lot of excitement at Magdala. They realized we finally have found the Magdala of Jesus's time. People have been looking for it for a long time, but they found it. And it was because a synagogue pillar was sticking up out of the ground. And it was just before they started building this Catholic retreat center. And so I visited the site in 2010, and I visited the site almost every year since. And Professor Strange was there, and he visited, he talked about it. And they uncovered a synagogue that was built in the 20s and then expanded later in the 40s and 50s and was destroyed in the 60s by General Titus during the Jewish revolt. Now, here's what makes that synagogue interesting. Not only is it right there at Magdala, which is likely the hometown of Mary of Magdala, Mary Magdalene, who followed Jesus. But there was an ornament, decorated stone found in the middle of it, facing the south toward Jerusalem.
Wow.
And it's covered with artwork that suggests the temple. And then, of course, naturally, the skeptics said, oh, well, that's one of a kind. The very next year, I mean, God's messing with people. The very next year, a second one is found in another synagogue in Galilee. And I'm trying to think of the name of the place, Horvat Kur.
Yeah.
And I know Byron McCain and the people working there. And it was a first century stone embedded in the wall as a decoration piece in a fourth or fifth century synagogue. So now we have two of these decorated stones. I'm beginning to think they probably were part of synagogue architecture in those days. What is the significance of this? These are Galilean synagogues way up north, and they have miniature temples carved in stone in the middle of the floor that people look at as they're hearing scripture read, songs sung, sermons preached. And it puts their mind on the temple to the south. This tells me that the Galileans were pious, took their faith seriously. They were thinking about the temple. It is consistent with a picture of Galilean disciples following Jesus to Jerusalem and scolding the ruling priests for not living up to the mandates and the trust that had been placed in them as ruling priests. It is very consistent. So I like those kinds of discoveries. They help nuance religious thinking and behavior in the time of Jesus.
Very much so. And as you know, I'm sure you've been there at Capernaum, there's a synagogue, there's a fourth century synagogue built over a first century synagogue that is built out of black basalt, and it's literally on the same floor plan. And if my memory serves me correctly, there was even an inscription discovered of the centurion who actually donated the money to build the synagogue, which may actually refer to the same centurion where Jesus actually healed. So I don't know where this guy's getting his information from. It's just mind-blowing.
Well, the archaeology, what it keeps doing is it shows that the gospel writers are informed.
Yeah.
They're talking about real places, real people, real buildings, real customs and practices. They're not making this stuff up. You can argue with the evangelist. You can say, well, does this really prove that Jesus is God's son? Does it really prove that he's the Savior? That's fine. These are theological and philosophical points of debate. But please don't tell me that the gospel writers don't know what they're talking about and they're inventing villages that didn't exist, people that didn't exist, and that kind of thing. That kind of radical skepticism, and you do hear it, it's out there. The mythicists who say Jesus never existed, that's the stuff of nonsense.
Yeah. Yeah, I could not agree more on that. About a year or so ago, I had a friend of mine ask me to write a guest blog on, and he asked me to do it on Jesus mythicism. And so I said, I'll write it as long as I can title the blog whatever I want. And so he said, okay. So I titled it, "What Are Jesus Mythicists Smoking?" Because they're not even following even radical liberal scholars. I mean, not even Bart Ehrman agrees with Jesus.
No, of course not. Yeah.
So let me ask you a follow-up question in connection with the synagogue question, and it's sort of a related question. It gets into Second Temple Judaism, or the Second Temple period, which dates to around, I guess, depending on who you ask, I don't know where you place the date, about the 500s BC all the way up to about 70 AD. So that would be the period leading up to the time of Christ, and it's where Judaism sort of rose up in the Hasmonean period. And then you've got the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes. and maybe there's another. I don't know if there's other groups, but those are the three major ones that we know about. I was in Jerusalem a few years ago, and I sort of, you know how you're walking in Old Jerusalem, you sort of get lost in those little back alleyways.
Oh
It's really,
yeah.
it's easy to get lost, and so I ended up finding this site, and it was a partially excavated southern part of Old Jerusalem, and I took lots of pictures, and I didn't know what it was. I didn't know what I was looking at. There was no signs on it, and so I did some research when I got back to the States and discovered that I was looking at the remnants of the Essene Gate, the Gate of the Essenes, and it was excavated by Bargil Pixner or something like that. I forget.
Yes, that's correct.
Yes, and so Herod actually had a gate built for the Essenes, and they had basically separated themselves from the Judaism that was being practiced in Jerusalem. So the two questions I have concerning the Essenes, and there's been a lot of conjecture about this. Number one, were they in existence during the time of Jesus and John the Baptist? And do you think John the Baptist may have had any interaction with the Essenes when he was there in the wilderness?
Well, I don't know of anyone that summed up the evidence better than the late Joseph Fitzmyer. And Fitzmyer, I tell you, he's one of these guys. I think he's from Missouri. He may have a Boston accent, but he's from Missouri. He's a show me guy. And if you can't show it he's passed on. He died at 96.
Wow.
He has to see the evidence. And if the evidence isn't there, he doesn't think so. Well, the evidence he finds quite compelling that, of course, the Essenes existed, and he's not quite sure what to make of the Essene Gate, but that's a good possibility on that. But he finds five, I think it is five very important points of correlation between what we know of the men of Qumran, thanks to the Dead Sea Scrolls, plus the ruins and the archaeological stuff at Qumran itself, the ancient testimonies that we have in Josephus and other writers, including Philo. And he thinks, there's a better than 50-50 chance that John was part of that group at some point. But the John we meet in the Gospels, who's on his own out in the wilderness, associated with Jesus, proclaiming to the people to repent, come to him for baptism, and so on, that's a John who is broken with that community.
Got it.
And so he may have brought some of their thinking, some of their eschatology, some of their practices, the interest in baptism. Isaiah 40, verse 3, prepare the way in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord. That could very well be an Essenic emphasis, because that's a big deal in their handbook that we call Seric, the rule book. It used to be called Manual of Discipline, especially column 8. So there's a chance that John was part of the Essenes, but the John we meet in the Gospels who introduces Jesus and so on, he's no longer an Essene.
Got it. Thank you. And that's sort of kind of where I didn't know how to articulate it quite that, and I didn't know that Fitzmyer held to that view. I'm gonna have to look into that. Thank you.
Yeah, his commentary on Luke, the first volume, he sums it up very well. And I don't think he ever, that was early 80s, and I don't think he ever varied from that as the years went by.
Okay. And then sort of a piggyback on that as well. So when Jesus comes on the scene, he only has around 3 years of public ministry. The Judaism as it was practiced in Jerusalem, would you say? I mean, it seems to be pretty obvious it had become corrupted and very Hellenized. Is that fair to say? Or is that an unfair assessment to say that the Pharisees and the Sadducees were sort of in the back pocket of the Romans?
Well, here's how I would put it. I would nuance it a little bit differently.
Okay.
And in the history of the church hasn't been very careful on that. Like they'll condemn the priesthood. Hold on a minute. There are two kinds of priests. You have the ruling priests, and then you have all the other priests
Yeah.
who functioned almost as laymen, village priests, and so on. So when Jesus heals the leper and says, "Show yourself to the priest," he's talking about a local village priest who would have been respected by the people, would not have been exploitive. But the people that Jesus criticizes would be relatively small numbered, in the dozens. The elite ruling priests in Jerusalem. They're the problem, and they're backed up by Sadducees and a small group at that. and certain scribes and teachers of the law. Most Pharisees, Jesus's problem with them is that, as Paul the Pharisee himself would agree, they're trying to perfect themselves by keeping the law perfectly, and they're very unforgiving towards sinners who don't keep the law perfectly. And so Jesus chastises them. But I think Jesus is very open to the possibility of Pharisees seeing the light and repenting and becoming followers. And guess what? Many of them did,
Yeah,
as the book of Acts makes clear. There's not one reference to a Sadducee who gets on board with the Jesus movement, and not one reference to a ruling priest who gets on board, but lower ranking priests do, and become Christians and followers of Jesus as well. So I think the real problem Jesus has, and this is why he's so popular with Galileans, but also Judeans, is he's an advocate for the people, and he chastises the oppressive ruling elite. They're the ones in bed with the Romans.
yeah,
They're the ones who are willing to compromise for political power and control over the people. But otherwise, the Jewish people as a whole, including the lower ranking priesthood, Jesus doesn't have any beef with them particularly. He, like John the Baptist, calls them to repent, purify themselves in light of God's work that's taking place now under the rubric of the rule of God or the kingdom of God.
absolutely. Thank you for that great explanation. Let me sort of shift gears now, so we sort of kind of wind things up a little bit. We've talked about the New Testament. We've talked about some of the archaeological discoveries, and we could do a whole nother show on that. Just in the past couple of years, of course, as you know, Pontius Pilate's signet ring was discovered at Herodium, which is amazing. Well, it was actually discovered, I think, in 1968, 69-ish, but that it wasn't actually deciphered until just a couple of years ago. And I tend to believe that it's legit, that it's actually really his signet ring. And we know from Josephus that Pilate he rose up in the ranks in Rome in the equestrian order. And so the ring is sort of has this equestrian, it's a kind of a simple, it would make sense because Herodium, of course, was built by Herod the Great and then taken over by Herod's son. So it would make sense that Pilate's signet ring would actually be in a place where you do official business. But so we could talk a lot about these discoveries, but and hopefully we can have time to before we jump into Acts, because I want to finish up with Acts in the early church and just get your thoughts on the reliability of Luke as a historian. Before you get to that, though, let me ask your quick opinion on a couple of ossuaries. One is the Caiaphas ossuary, and the other one is the James ossuary. And so those who are listening who may not know what an ossuary is, these are for lack of a better term, easiest way to put it, it's a bone box. It's a limestone carved box about the length of a human femur, maybe a little bit longer. And these were used exclusively during a period called the Second Temple period, again, about 500 BC to all the way to 70 AD. And this sort of developed in Judaism. And had Jesus stayed in the tomb, his bones would have eventually ended up in an ossuary. But several years ago, I think it was in 1991, there were some construction workers in Jerusalem who actually discovered in the Talpiot neighborhood, I think, in Jerusalem, they discovered these first century Jewish tombs, and in one of them was discovered this ossuary, very ornately carved ossuary saying Joseph ben Caiaphas. And so, so Dr. Evans, do you think that is the actual, and by the way, the ossuary actually contained the bones of a 60-year-old man. So do you think that that's the same Caiaphas that we read about in the New Testament?
I am inclined to see it that way. I was skeptical for probably, I don't know, 15 years after its discovery, thinking that I was troubled by the phonetics of the spelling because, yes, it does say Kayafa on one side of the box. On another side, it could be Kofa or Kufa or something like that. There is no vowel or no consonant in the middle to give it that Y sound. But that argument has been challenged successfully. We've also found the same name on another ossuary about 10 years ago, referring to a granddaughter, a daughter of a man who's a priest, who in turn is the son of a Caiaphas who's a priest. And there we actually have the word priest and the same name showing up again, and I thought, okay, that's it. And at one time, I didn't think the tomb was ornate enough. Yeah, I've learned a lot more about tombs in the last 30 years. It's just the cellar, it's the basement that we have. That's not going to be very ornate. There probably was a magnificent superstructure above it. So my reservations have been answered by Shimon Gibson and some other archaeologists. So yeah, I think it is the ossuary, and if it is the ossuary, that 60-year-old skeleton in it, that would be the skeleton of Caiaphas, the high priest, who condemned Jesus. So that's an interesting
Yeah,
point of connection there.
definitely. Okay, what about the James ossuary? I know that.
Yeah, well, yeah. Uh, there are only two ossuaries I know of that read this way, where you say so and so, son of somebody, brother of somebody else. There's this one, and it's Yaakov uh, Bar Yosef Achwe de Yeshua. That's how it reads. So it's Jacob or James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus. Okay, there's only one other ossuary that has that same grammatical structure. So we don't know for sure, but a very educated guess is the brother is the best known of the three. That's why it breaks with the pattern. Normally it's just so and so or so and so son of somebody. But to have a so and so son of somebody, brother of somebody else, implies that that brother is the one who defines both of the other guys.
That's right. Yeah,
Well, does that fit what we know of Jesus in the New Testament? Of course it does.
yeah.
So, who's James? He's a famous guy. He led the church in Jerusalem for 20 years until he was martyred by the same family, by the way,
Mm.
that Caiaphas was part of.
Wow.
So there's a family feud. So you have this Jesus and his family on the one side, and Annas the Great and his five sons and his son-in-law Caiaphas on the other. And Josephus talks about them and admits that they were violent. And early Jewish interpretation, rabbinic interpretation, says they were violent and they had guards that worked for them and they beat you over the head with their clubs. They would steal more than their fair share of the tithes
Mm.
from the place the warehouse where tithes were kept, and they'd knock their own fellow lower ranking priests around and take their portion as well. So they were bad guys. And so there's this family feud. So this bone box probably does belong to the well-known James and Joseph and Jesus. Can't prove it.
Yeah.
You can add up all the names you want and say there's one chance in 10 or whatever, and people have tried to calculate that. And that's true if you just go with pure statistics and names. But the way that it's written there, it's James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus. In my mind, that points in the direction of the New Testament identification.
Very good. A few years ago, there was a book written by Ben Witherington and Herschel Shanks. Is that a good book for folks to check out?
Oh yeah,
Okay.
yeah, it is. Yeah, it's popular. Of course, it's written before a lot of the scientific testing was done and all that. But the scientific testing in the end did vindicate the authenticity of it. That was a shameful mess.
Right.
I mean, I followed it very closely. I know Herschel Shanks very well, and I've read his report and everything else. And I mean, that was just, I mean, this is almost like the Russian collusion hoax, trying to prove that the James ossuary, the last part of the inscription was added later. And there were people that lied to the police about it. And there are legal implications and punitive financial
Wow.
implications awaiting some of those people.
And this goes to show you that archaeology is a battleground just like anything else. And
Oh, yeah.
there's a lot that's at stake in that. Was the scholar involved? Because it's been a while since I've read the book. Was it Andre Lamar that
Yeah. Yeah, Andre Lemaire is a French epigrapher and Old Testament scholar. I do know him. He's a great scholar. And he was indignant when people started shooting from the hip and suggesting that the inscription was fake or part of it was fake. It had called into question his competence. He was really irked,
yeah,
and rightly so, about that. But there was a geochemist that committed perjury and gave police false information. All of it was jealousy and very bad motives, and so on. And then under oath, he had to retract what he had told the police because other scientists had checked. And without getting into the details, authentic ancient patina was present in all five of the words, the three personal names and the two other words that give us that five-word inscription: Jacob, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus. Ancient patina, which you can't fake, was present in all five inscribed words. So the authenticity of it is now beyond question. The identity, of course, that we
Yeah.
can still discuss that.
Well, it's as I've told my students and my listeners, archaeological discoveries, we're not you can't get 100% certainty. We have degrees of probability, and there are some discoveries that have higher degrees. But again, you do the you look at the who uh, who was in Jerusalem, whose name was James, whose brother was Jesus. You start to do the math, and it starts to really point to the fact that this really was the brother of Jesus, and he was a fascinating figure in himself because he didn't believe Jesus was actually the Son of God. I mean, for early in the Gospels, even records Jesus is teaching in the home, and he's outside the door saying, hey, let's just get him out of here because he's embarrassing us. And then later, he not only becomes the leader of the church in Jerusalem, but he's martyred for actually believing that Jesus is risen from the dead. So fascinating guy and a fascinating artifact. All right, so we just got a couple minutes left, and we'll finish up with this. Thank you so much for coming on. The early church, of course, the two books I'm thinking of in the New Testament are the Gospel of Luke and the Book of Acts. And several years ago, I was actually mentored by Dr. Norman Geisler. I don't know if knew Dr. Geisler, and he's an apologist, but I'm an archaeologist. But he sort of helped me, compile my thoughts together on a lot of stuff. But he told me about a book by Colin Hemer, the Book of Acts in the Setting of Hellenistic History. And that is a fantastic book, and I think he's passed away now. But what Hemer does is he retraces the Apostle Paul's missionary journeys through the book of Acts and looks at it from a historian standpoint. And he's sort of following the footsteps of an earlier scholar back in the 19th century, William Ramsay. So Dr. Evans, are there any new studies that are coming out that are validating some of these Colin Hemer study, and then also William Ramsay, and some of the reliability of Luke and Acts?
Yes. And of course, the challenge is doing archaeology in Turkey.
Yes.
It's always been difficult in the best of times.
What do I know
And
that?
yeah,
I'm
so,
actually working on a project right now in Turkey, so I know what you're talking about.
well, for me, one of the sites I'd love to see excavated is Colossae.
Mm.
And I've been to that site a couple of times. You got to watch the thistles. Good grief. Take your pants and stuff them in your socks and wrap it up. Those thistles will go right through your trousers into your ankles. But in any case, poppies and thistles, but it's worth getting jabbed a few times to the tell is very obvious where the original center of the city was. And I've walked up on the tell, and there's carved stone sticking out of the ground,
Wow.
dressed stone. So the excavate you would have to dig very deep. Just I'd get a flamethrower and burn off all the thistles and then go to work. And anyway, I mention that only because there's more archaeological work that needs to be done in areas that Paul visited, and they're difficult to go. His whole first missionary journey is there in Turkey, today's Turkey. And but I agree with that observation that you in the way you summed it up and introduced it. Colin Hemer, in effect, was sort of the 20th century Sir William Ramsay of the 19th century. And it just confirmed again and again that the author of Luke Acts knows what he's talking about. I think the we sections, as we call it, where he's in the first person plural, we went there, then this happened to us. I think that's authentic material. I don't think it's some faker that's added it to the story. I think this is Luke. Sometimes he's talking because he was there, and he's not even relying on sources anymore because he is the source. If this is a fiction, if it were unreliable, then we would find mistakes, goofs, dislocations everywhere. but we don't. And it goes right back to what I said at the top of the program. Archaeologists use not just Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they also use Acts, and not just for Israel, but anywhere else, because the author clearly knows what he's talking about. He doesn't share everything, he does condense things sometimes, but he's informed, he's accurate, and classicists know that. So they may not be New Testament interpreters, but they use the New Testament materials, especially Acts, that assist them in doing their work in the history of Greece and Rome.
That's great. So yeah, and to kind of one other quick thing, in connection with Colin Heemer and William Ramsey, just in the last few years or so, two inscriptions were discovered that did confirm, again, some of the little small details that only an eyewitness would know. The Gallio inscription, they actually found the name of Gallio, one of the people that were mentioned in the book of Acts, and then also a technical name of a Roman ruler, a Polytarchon, I think it was. And so Luke, who's writing the Gospel of Luke and also Acts, he's recording these very minute Greco-Roman like political offices that only someone who was alive at the time would actually know about. And so the archaeology actually backs it up. So thank you so much for Dr. Evans for coming on and for your vast knowledge of this subject. And let me just sort of ask you this will be the final question, sort of wrap us up. And that is just again, just a summary. We've been talking about archaeology and history and the manuscripts, things like that. To your knowledge, is there any other religion that you know of that has the amount of archaeological and historical background support for the Bible?
Well, of course, the Jewish people would say they do for the Old Testament, but of course, we're talking the same thing, really. No, the answer is no, and one of the reasons for that is simply the Jewish and Christian faiths are closely tied to history. And so it's all about a story. And for Israel, it's about their formation, Exodus, Sinai, covenant, and so on. Christianity presupposes that and continues the story with Jesus. And so the Judeo Christian faith is rooted in history. And if the history is wrong, the message collapses. In other words, Christianity is not a philosophy. It may contain a philosophy, it may support a philosophy, but it isn't a philosophy. But Buddhism is a philosophy, so it really doesn't matter if the historical Buddha is found or we know what he said. It doesn't matter. The philosophy is somehow linked to him, but it's the philosophy that counts, and that's the way it is with most, even Islam. It doesn't really matter if anything is known about Muhammad. There are traditions about him and so on. What counts is what's in the Quran. That's all that matters. And the Quran, if you've read it, and I have, is not a book of history. It's not a story. It's an argument. It's a meditation. That's what it is. It's a philosophy, in other words.
Sure.
And if you accept it, fine. But for Christianity, it's about what God did, things that happened, and how God revealed himself in what happened.
Yeah.
And if those things didn't happen, then that has a huge negative implication for Christian truth claims.
Thank you so much, Dr. Evans. And again, thank you again for coming on. And with that, we're going to go ahead and wrap things up. Thank you so much for watching Monocle and Spade podcast, the podcast of epic archaeology, where we explore the world of the Bible and beyond through the lens of history and archaeology. Thank you, guys. God bless you, and hope you have a great day.